Today on Conversations Aloud, we're discussing how technology, such as blockchain, is being used to improve environmental and social standards for companies, and how it's keeping our data safe. We're joined by Rachel Byfleet, who is a communications and policy analyst. She has a master's in international public policy with experience in EU policy and data regulation. Welcome to the show, Rachel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me in this early morning.
Yeah, great to have you. Can you start off with giving us a broad overview of what is ESG
Mhm.
and why it has become so central to business strategy today?
Yeah, so ESG is kind of the way that companies will report on their environmental and social responsibilities. And the reason it's become so important is because, like most of us, the consumer wants to vote with their wallet. And so, as we get all of these daunting kind of realizations that climate change is becoming real and true, we want our like where we shop, we want them to be as environmentally friendly, and we want to know that what they say is true. We've all been in the situation where you get stuck in the line. For me, it's skincare. The skin goop is really the place where I get stuck. And I look at all these different products and it says this is made from all natural things. There's no added blah, blah, blah. And I kind of get put off because I think, oh, is there any added things? Like if you have to say that, does that mean that what you're saying is real? And so anyway, we've got ourselves in this loop where we want to know what companies are saying is true.
So it's consumer driven.
Mm.
Is it? Do you see more people kind of focusing on ESG, or it's almost like which one is a bigger driver? Is it cost? Do people care about cost more than ESG, or is it ESG more than cost? I guess it depends on the consumer, right?
Yeah, I think that's going to change, to be honest. I think cost in the sense of, in one, I guess on one hand, as a consumer, you'd be willing to pay more for something that you know is really ethical and has been well made, doesn't have any traces of modern slavery, is good for the environment. In a perfect world, I'd be willing to pay a premium for that, but it's the cost of living crisis that we find ourselves in. And so, is it just easier to order that product that I want to get from a local shop on Amazon and get that delivered? And I don't know where that's
Yeah.
come from. So, I think we find ourselves in a bit of a tricky situation.
Yeah, it is. But a lot of people will care more about the ESG element than the cost, to your point. So going into what you said there, which is, you know, uh, companies can say whatever on the tin. How does it work right now? Because in my head, I have there's a agency. I'm just making this up. There's an agency in my head that kind of looks at these products and makes sure everything is actually accurate. Is that how it works?
Well, in theory, there's legislation that kind of is supposed to make sure that companies are saying what they're saying is true, I suppose. But it's kind of how that's monitored and implemented, isn't it? So, yeah, in theory, what you read should be true, but it's a whole spider web of what is the actual logistics of each supply chain, and to go into that and to get into the nitty gritty of that for monitoring is so vast that I still have a hard time believing what we read is the actual case, even though
Mm,
we know that it's regulated. So I don't know. And it depends on which country you're in and who's further along. But the EU is they're meant to do a blanket sweep, I suppose, of legislation that tackles this.
I always imagine the EU is kind of heavy on the regulation compared to the US.
Yeah,
I can imagine in the US, more things are allowed that maybe shouldn't be allowed in terms of what ingredients can enter, which are safe, but not really safe. Is that how you kind of see the market too?
yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm from the States originally, and I've actually just gone back to the States for a little visit. And oh man, I actually got really overwhelmed. You just go into a regular supermarket and you look down the aisle and it's just like covered in different promos. And for me, I'm really interested in food and food policy. And so I find what I buy really important. And I want to make sure that I'm shopping ethical and buying free range and making sure I'm taking care of what goes into my body. And just in some of the supermarkets, and it depends on where you go and what state you're in, but there's all these pop-ups of, this is ethically farmed or there's no added hormones. And I'm like, ah, if you have to
Yeah.
say that, I don't know if I can trust that. So,
Yeah. Isn't it like the chicken they even say like it's chlorine free
mm,
chicken?
exactly.
Which is not something I've ever heard of over here because I think everything is chlorine free.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
quite frankly, it's something that the consumer really shouldn't have to hear about. It should all,
Yeah.
you should just be confident that what you buy at the supermarket has been vetted is, something that you can trust and you feel comfortable that you're not adding to this world of doom and gloom.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that we're holding big businesses to account. I think that's the key thing is that we're living in a time when businesses are getting bigger and bigger and it's hard to trust them because it just feels like we're in this doom loop. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
especially when you consider kind of the lobbying that they can do, in the US too, which is really interesting that that is allowed.
I know. As
But
someone who would be a lobbyist myself, I mean, working in policy and public affairs, I think, yeah, oh man, just looking at my peers in the States, what they can do compared to what I can do is just, whoa.
yeah, that's interesting. So how exactly is technology coming in,
Mm.
and being used to enhance ESG efforts?
Yeah. So one of the things I've been looking at over the last several months is blockchain technology. And before I got this gig, I thought that blockchain only related to crypto. And I don't know anything about crypto. And actually, I'm quite put off by the whole thing. I mean, it might be cool. I'm not sure. But I was like trying to understand what does blockchain mean in terms of how we can make companies more transparent, how we can, track the supply chain, the life cycle of products. And so that's one piece of technology that I've kind of seen come into this space. And it's really interesting because it's both simple and complicated now that I've had my chance to get my head around it a bit. But it does offer this way that there's no way that companies can't be transparent if they're using blockchain technology to kind of track and be transparent about the supply chain. So that's one way that I think it's coming in. Whether or not that'll be regulated across as part of legislation, there's a long way to go. But if companies want to voluntarily use it, I think it would be a real plus to gain
So can you
trust.
can you walk us through, because to your point, yeah, a lot of people hear blockchain, will hear
Yeah.
cryptocurrency. How does blockchain work to improve the ESG efforts? Like, how does that
Yeah.
recording work? Maybe through an example or something like that.
Yeah. So in the way that you can do ESG reporting, I'll use food as an example because that's what I'm most familiar with. In terms of food supply chain, tuna, let's even go more niche. I don't know if we've all seen that documentary where tuna, we don't know where it comes from. It actually could be really dangerous and it kills a lot of dolphins, etc. And then it put me off eating tuna for like several months because I didn't know if I was doing the right thing. If a company who sells tuna specifically wants to use blockchain technology to show their transparency, it cuts out the third party. So there's no way that, there's like no middleman to kind of do the labeling and things. It comes straight from the farmer. And we know that it comes from this farmer. We know the exact life cycle that it's gone through because they enter the information into a distributed ledger that gets verified by other computers. So we know that there's no tampering. It's very clear and straightforward. And then by the time
So, sorry, how does that work? Because can't the farmer just put any data in
well, they would
if
have
they?
to well, that's a good point. It is trusting the farmer to put it into the system, but it's the whole company. It's audited and it makes sure that basically no one can kind of tamper with there's no, oh, this came from this country and then it went through this loop and we don't know where it went and then it kind of ended up on our shelves in the UK and there's no paperwork, no shuffling that could have gotten lost. It's just in the system, in the blockchain, and that's very verified. But to your point, there's a huge educational piece for farmers to have to do that, right? And so it's easy for companies like IBM is doing a whole food push on how to kind of connect farmers directly with consumers. But farmers themselves, I mean, for me in Minnesota, I don't think the corn grower down the road is going to be able to put that into blockchain themselves. And so it's a bigger company umbrella to kind of track the company rather than the individual farmer. If that makes sense?
Yeah, so you've got the kind of farmer that's inputting this data on this kind of universal ledger that's shared between different parties.
Hmm.
And the idea is that you can see the chain of events that are happening from farmer to getting it to your home.
Exactly.
Kind of like where it's been, how, who
Who's been involved?
modified it, if anything, in terms of the product. And I think this is very beneficial for maybe like, as you said, tuna or maybe even honey, because I've heard honey gets mixed with so many different types of honey. So you've got like EU honey, but it's actually mixed with Chinese honey, and you don't know
Yeah,
where the honey is coming from.
totally. And it's one of those, like, you wanna make the right decision when you're at the grocery store, but then how are you supposed to make that decision exactly as you say? Um, and this is supposed to kind of take the pressure off of everybody, and it just what it means is that the investment into being transparent is good, but of course companies are a little bit put off by it. It's expensive to kind of change your systems around, but I think it's important to build the trust. Me as a consumer, I want to be able to trust what I buy is what it says.
Yeah. So how would that work for the consumer? Would they kind of like go to the shop, scan something, and like on their phone it shows kind of where it's been, or how would
They
that technology actually translate to consumer?
they can do. I think what I think actually will happen in practice as this becomes more popular is the consumer won't have to think about it as much. They can, if they want to, dig into the deep depths of it. But at the moment, I think you are responsible for doing the research on what you get at the supermarket. I think the responsibility falls on the consumer. And I think what blockchain does is it takes the responsibility off the consumer. And I think that's a good thing. So you can kind of check where it's coming from. But I think as you know that a company uses that technology, your automatic thinking is it's really transparent and it's immutable. You can't change the ledgers. So I would trust it.
Just for people listening to this, they might ask, okay, so why is a blockchain more trustful than the standard that we have right now?
Hmm.
You said that you can't edit it. What how does that like? What does that actually mean?
Yeah. So when you input information into the into blockchain use it in general, you're putting information in, it creates a block. And it's this ledger that goes to all other users of blockchain. And they have to verify that. So it's not like, oh, I put this in and, a person in my company is verifying that. And so we know that we can kind of play the books however we want. Maybe it's about, we can have it's different than having somebody in your company verify. What happens is it goes out to everybody around the world who uses blockchain. So there's no incentive to lie about it, right? It's saying like, yes, this is true. What I've put in is true. And that creates the chain and the blockchain. And once that's created, you can't edit it. If you wanted to put in different information, you'd have to put in a new blockchain that would have to be re-verified. And so what we're having, I guess what you're seeing is something that literally cannot be changed or tampered with. And that's why it makes it so secure.
Got it. So the blockchain is kind of like a data point that is being verified without the incentive to kind of lie about it, because the incentive is more about verification
Like,
of the accurate data. And then once that's verified, it's there and it cannot be changed. And you can kind of see the all the kind of steps from start to end in one place that it hasn't been tampered with.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. I hope I explained that okay.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's great. Um, so you see kind of blockchain, it's not part of the legislation, it's more now voluntary, but companies might go through that route because it gives the consumer, some confidence in the products.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it is voluntary at the moment. I think blockchain's at a weird standpoint at the moment. A lot of governments have kind of recognized that it is important. It's something to kind of look at. The OECD is saying it is kind of one of those futuristic things. I don't think that the EU is looking at how to kind of integrate it more into policy, but at the moment, countries are a little bit at a standstill. They recognize it's really good and they recognize that it's going to come into play. But what that looks like, I think, is a little bit unclear. But of course, we've got the digital strategy from the EU being rolled out, and blockchain doesn't play a huge part in it. But I think moving forward, it's kind of people are kind of understanding that it's a bit more valuable and that it can offer a lot in terms of these types of reporting. So, yeah, I think we're in a really interesting space where it can kind of pop up and shift the conversation from just being around crypto. I think that's the key thing is not that crypto is bad, and I don't know that much about it, as I mentioned, but I think there's a lot more it can offer in terms of healthcare. It can offer a lot in terms of education. Really just making sure that it cuts out the third party and it's really end to end from supplier to consumer. Yeah, whichever you want to look at it. Yeah.
And why is it important to cut out the third party?
It just means that there's
Sorry, the middleman.
yeah, the middleman in the sense of there's no way that there can be it cuts out the risk for data breaches. So, and it cuts out the risk of, I guess, relying on someone else for your data. And we're coming into this era of, data ownership. Where is my data going? Who has access to it? And by cutting out the middleman, you really just have, I'll take healthcare, for example. It's if you have your health records that come straight from your doctor and you have access to them. There's no app you have to use. There's no system. It's you have access to what is put into the system. And it's just this direct relationship that I think we kind of miss. You have to download in the States, my chart, and then that has all your data and it comes from different, yeah, it's just lots of middlemen. But then if there's a data breach, you don't know where your data's gone because it's on all of these different third-party apps, right?
Mm. So when it comes to data, data is stored somewhere, right?
Mm.
In a third with a third party. And what you're saying is that you wouldn't need to store that data with a third party
No, it'd be on the
if you
blockchain.
use the blockchain?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then you can access it, and it sounds really one of the things I really struggle with blockchain is how it can both be public and private, and that is one thing I really struggled with to kind of get my head around, and a good way to kind of think about it is there's public blockchains, and when you create these, you get two separate keys, and you could think about it as a mailbox. So if I'm gonna send a letter just directly to you, I wouldn't send it to someone to send it to you. I'm going to send you a piece of mail. You have a key that can open the mailbox. And if it was a private letter, and if it was a public letter, it'll just go straight to you. You can open, you can just have it. And so, in terms of medical records, that's something I struggled with. Is I don't want my medical records on this public, forum. But really, it's just saying that you can act. You would have to have a private key, like a code, if you will, to access the information that you want private. I hope that doesn't sound so
Yeah.
complicated, but it's supposed to be very simple.
Yeah, yeah. So what you're saying is basically, when you're sending something on a private blockchain, you have to have the key to be able to open that door, and
Exactly.
only you have the key.
Mhm.
So that's why it's private, and secure. So, just to kind of talk about data, when we say data, what kind of companies hold most of our data, and what does data actually mean?
That's a good question. Let's use any major social media place. That will be a good way to start. I mean, Meta holds so much of our data, and the biggest thing they do with it is they advertise to us, right? And so it could be anything. It could be my name, it could be my age, it could be where I work, it could be anything about me. Can just be your data. And then, of course, it could be more like my financial data. Maybe I buy things on Meta. I don't, but if I did, they could have that type of data, and they could have data about where I live, what I like to do for fun. And they collate all of this to create a picture of who I am. And then normally, what they use it for is advertising that I don't want, I didn't ask for. But of course, I use the platform for free. One of their platforms, let's say, let's go Instagram, and they target these ads at me. And what the future and what I think the EU is doing a good job at is trying to put the data ownership back into individuals' hands. So right now, I don't know where my data is. I don't know who has access to it. I don't know what websites have it. I mean, we can put the cookie accepting things on every website, but I actually don't know what that means as an average person. And so I think the future that we're moving toward is I want to be able to erase my data. I want to have the right to be forgotten from the internet. I want to make sure that what I post isn't going to stay in some abyss forever. I want to make sure that my bad Facebook choices aren't still up from 2010. Um, all of that. And I also think the reason this is coming to light, in my opinion, on social media specifically, is we're targeting really at different ads to really vulnerable young people as well. And
Mm.
there's no control over who has their data. So as a parent, it's actually quite scary because if I don't know where my data is, you wouldn't know where your child's data is really either. And that's a really kind of interesting place to be in.
Yeah, no, that is. I can imagine, you said Facebook. Facebook owns, obviously, Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp.
Yeah,
I'm assuming they use the data from, how we're speaking and how what we're communicating about, collect all of that data,
totally.
and have a pretty accurate description of our behavior and how we think.
Mhm.
Have you seen the movie Don't Look Up?
No, I haven't. What's it about?
Oh, it's great. It's a comedy about it's a kind of comedy, dark comedy about a comet that's gonna come and hit Earth. But there's a debate on whether it's real or not, and all the scientists are like, "It's real, we can see it," and people are like, "Don't look up, it's fake news." But one of the guys in there is like this mega, basically pretending to be like the Facebook Zuckerberg, and they have all this analysis, and they're like having this conversation with someone, and they're telling them, "Oh, we know you're gonna die by this kind of animal that doesn't exist yet," and the
Oh my
accuracy
gosh.
is 95%. But they have that data, and it is scary because you can get to a situation which we're actually seeing right now in China, which is they'll look at what you're doing online and actually give you a score, a social score,
Yeah.
which dictates what facilities you are able to use. And if you say the wrong thing, they'll say, well, you can't use the train now because we don't like what you said.
Well,
We don't see that over here, obviously, but there is potential for something like that to happen.
mhm.
And for a government to own or have access to that much data about an individual is it goes to kind of can be an attack on freedom and possibly our ability to have the free liberty that we experience today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's moral questions in several different countries. I might butcher this, but there is something happening in Germany with data that like police officers can use about your movements and things, and how far does that actually go before it becomes really dangerous? So is it that we can use your data and it's for only large scale crimes, maybe terrorism, I don't know. Or is it, oh, you ran that red light and we know you did, oh, now we're going to come get you. It's this, like, yeah, exactly as you say. How do we answer the moral questions so that we maintain our freedom? But there's so much data out there, and it's either use it or it sits there. And I think at the moment, I just feel like it would be important to know where and who has my data. Um,
Yeah. Do you know whether in the EU there's regulation around how long you can hold the data for?
I think there is the GDPR regulation is pretty robust in the EU, and they also have quite a lot in terms of they've got a data ownership. They have legislation in place about what that kind of looks like. It's all rolling out very swiftly, actually, because I think, like me, people want to know where their data is. And so I don't know the exact length in terms of GDPR, but I think you have to get rid of it in a certain time. And for instance, I know that I don't know how often you come across GDPR regulations in the UK, but the EU's is quite a lot stricter. So I think,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, ours is just like a subset of that, which is interesting. Because I still feel afraid of GDPR a lot.
Yeah. If anyone doesn't know what GDPR is, when you go online and now every website you go to has, do you accept this? Do you accept these cookies or whatever? That's because of GDPR.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It made internet just so much worse.
And
Uh,
my husband's a software developer. This goes a little bit off topic, but he was saying that he's looked into some of the behind the scenes of the cookies, and a lot of them are just for show. Like, they don't actually mean anything. Like, some of them were, like,
really,
they're not getting rid of like your cookies in general. And I thought that
yeah,
was so interesting. I was like, it's all a lie. This is why I'm so paranoid at the grocery store, and I don't know where
mm,
my products come from.
yeah, yeah. I can imagine.
Yeah.
So how does technology kind of help us with respect to data?
Mm.
Um, you mentioned there the healthcare point about removing the middleman and therefore removing kind of storing that data in a third party, which might be hacked. Um, can you give other examples of how technology can be used here?
Yeah, I think another interesting one that I would personally benefit from is how do we use it in the education sector as well? So I think I keep mentioning blockchain, but there are really good kind of examples of how this plays out. One of the things that I was finding when I was researching is that you can just hold your degree on your phone end to end from your university. I mean, you do that in paper form anyway, but it's about digitizing that. And what does that look like when you want to show your credentials? Like, if you have to prove to your employer your credentials, at the moment, I'd have to go in on my file cabinet that I don't have because I'm not mature enough for that, get my degree out, scan it on my computer, and then email it. Whereas if I just had like a government app, or it doesn't have to be a government app, but it sounds like that might be the way we're having personal ID cards and things like that. I could just access my latest health records. I don't have to log into anything for. I can look at my degree and I can just kind of prove that at and when I need to. And I find that really interesting because, again, I don't know where all of this information sits. Like, I guess I'd have to go on my university, but they probably use a third party app. And I just recently, I mentioned I got my master's a couple years ago. And so to prove where all that comes from, and we're moving away from paper trails, it's all going online. And I think it could really help us, to be honest. I'd be happy to have some place, a wallet on my phone, like the Apple Wallet I normally use, with my driver's license, my passport, my all my information, if it was really secure and I felt like I didn't I wasn't giving up anything by doing that. I think I've now just realized that I like using PayWave, which is dangerous, but that's just one example of kind of having that all at your beck and call. And I think that's kind of where we're moving toward. But I wonder how well I just I'm accepting of that, but I'm just thinking of my poor parents who can't figure out how to open up the computer. That's where I worry that technology is helping us, but will we leave kind of a generation out of that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the kind of degree because I just remember when I went to my last job, I just had to provide a paper, and it's just now I'm thinking about it, that's just so basic.
Yeah,
Just anyone can provide any paper.
totally. There's no verification on
So
that at all.
yeah, it's interesting that they haven't used blockchain already with respect to that, but I think they will have to, because it'll be easier and easier to kind of fake a paper
Totally.
document.
Yeah.
But going to kind of the data, my understanding is most of the data is actually stored in the US.
Mm,
That's where most of our data is, and for people who are asking, I guess, what's the problem with companies having our data? One of the things that have you come across Cambridge Analytic?
yes.
Is it,
Yeah.
this company that used our Facebook data essentially to showcase certain ads based on what they thought would motivate you to vote in a particular way and kind of actually play on your emotions essentially
Mm,
to make you go vote, but in a particular way. And you can hire them basically. It's a private company that you can just hire to do the work of convincing people from an emotion perspective by showing you ads that might not be accurate to make you vote in a particular way. And that happened in the 2016 Brexit. And I think in a lot of countries, they actually found that they were used to manipulate or to switch people's voting to another particular group. So that was very interesting.
yeah. I find that quite scary. I've done a bit of an in-depth on the Cambridge Analytica scandal because that is like the key part of society that I mean, I don't think we should be targeted with anything personally all the time as it is, but there's a difference between wanting to sell me a particular yogurt versus getting my voting behavior to change to
Mm,
a way that the powers that be think I should be voting. And that's really dangerous, I think. Um, and I think, as you mentioned, a lot of our data is stored in the US. And a good example of how this is a bit of a problem is with the TikTok um, thing that we're seeing, where the US, well, the TikTok wants to store their data, rightfully, I guess. We do it for, I mean, I say we as Americans do it in with Meta in Silicon Valley. So if TikTok wants to store their data in China, well, then they're under that's under Chinese legislation, whereas it would be under American legislation. And why that matters for us in the UK is, again, if I don't know where my data is, but it might be some on a server somewhere in the US where I'm not protected by UK legislation anymore. And I find that really dangerous to have, yeah, just this kind of wild, wild west of who owns what and what country is it in. And yeah, it's just quite
yeah.
dangerous, isn't it?
It is, it is. You've got the kind of as you mentioned, the foreign entity which has access to our data,
Mhm.
but even inside, the West, the whole Cambridge Analytica thing is pretty much safe to say it's an attack on democracy.
Absolutely
If
it is.
people can manipulate, because the democracy is based on you being able to make informed decisions, and if you're given just any data to manipulate your decision making, then we're not in a factual world anymore, and everyone is in their own world, which is what social media is, a lot of the times, really.
Mm.
Um, as someone who's worked in kind of, I guess, data regulation, EU policy, what trends are you seeing in the regulatory landscape right now, and how are they impacting kind of like consumers or companies?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing I focus very much on the EU, so I guess that's what I can speak on. But I think the EU is, I think they're actually smashing it in terms of getting up to speed with data. I think it's oftentimes that government's really behind, but they are trying desperately to get in front of it, and I think they're doing an okay job. So we have the EU digital strategy, and then under that, we've got the EU data strategy. And then as a pillar under that, we've got things like the Data Governance Act and the Data Act. And I can't figure out if it's data or data. And as I'm talking, but yeah. And so there's several different pieces of legislation that are going around to kind of put in more regulation, but I would argue that it gives us more control as the user and consumer. But I think it's kind of scary. It's a scary time for businesses. I mean, they have to deal with a lot of regulation. I've done a lot of research into actually what that compliance looks like. Um, and it's just going to be a lot of investment on their end to try and make sure that there's somebody in place that knows about the Data Governance Act and can make sure that they're complying with it. But then what that means for us as consumers or citizens, I guess, we're not, I mean, not in the EU specifically, but I would imagine the UK does something to follow suit. But what it means for citizens is that you can feel safe knowing that you are in control of your data. The whole thing is to put control back into individuals' hands while keeping companies really responsible.
How does that happen? How would that transfer to the in consumers' hands?
Yeah, just making sure that if a company has your data, you know that they have to get permission from you. You can go in and edit that data. And so if I want to change my name or if I don't want the company to have my data anymore, I can know do you know what it is? It's making the cookie thing real. It's making it so that if you actually wanted to go in to any website you use, or Meta is a really good example, you can go in and edit the things that you want to. And then one of the things that I find interesting is that we can kind of do this right to be forgotten from
Hmm.
different places. And I know I struggle with this because the internet is really vast. And a part of me thinks that it does hold a lot of information that I don't know if we should be able to just delete. But then me personally, I kind of like the idea that I could be having the right to be forgotten because I don't pay for the internet and I don't know why it has so much control over me. So I don't
Yeah.
know. There's these moral implications as well. But what I'm saying is that there's more legislation being in place, but I think it gives citizens more freedom.
Can,
So
can you explain that right to be forgotten? What does that mean?
yeah, just I don't know, if on Google, you wanted to Google yourself and you had something, um, data about you coming up, not so much a news story, but let's say Meta holds data that you don't want it to hold. For instance, you had about your age or your gender or something like that. You can kind of tell them, I don't want you to hold this data anymore. I want you to delete it all. And they have to delete it because you have the right as a person to be forgotten. And I think that's important, but also I find it a little bit of a rub because I think that the internet has such a vast library of our information. So I don't know. Yeah, that's something that I find I would be interested to hear your thoughts on if you think it's a moral thing or not.
I think it's great that consumers have access, the ability to do that.
Mm,
I just don't know how it work in practice in terms of because Facebook might have sold that data
exactly.
already to someone else, and like there's so much change. We can use the blockchain to find out where the chain is.
Yeah, well, in an ideal world, yes, but you're right,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think that's why the EU is putting in more legislation to try to make sure that like Facebook has to tell you where it's gone. But then
Okay.
if it's me and I go into Facebook and Facebook's definitely sold my data to who knows who, then I don't know if I have the capacity or time to go to each one of those places and say, "Look, I need you to delete my data." Like, who's time to do that? It's not that's that easy or straightforward. So, um, I guess the idea is that it will be, and that's what they're working toward. But you're right.
Well, if there's any listeners that want to start a business,
Yeah,
this is the one to go after. Provide a service where you can delete all someone's data
yeah,
and do all the legwork. I think that's a good business.
yeah.
So
I think so. I mean, it would be nice to have all of your, like I say, middle school Facebook pictures. That would be good if those were never seen by anyone ever again.
yeah, it's that's the only thing that I like about this forget me kind of feature, which is kind of removing your teenage years and the silly things you said
Totally.
back then.
Yeah, the
Definitely
status
delete
things.
that. It's horrible. No, it definitely makes me cringe every time I someone sends me something. Oh, you said this. Like, oh God.
Yeah, I don't
Um,
wanna be reminded of that ever again.
yeah.
Yeah.
What does the public? What do you feel the public gets wrong about data?
Mm, I think a and I think this is slightly changing, but I think the public at the moment is too quick to give up their data. And an example of this, and I'm totally guilty of it as well. I was just again in the US and it's I'm at a store and they say, "Oh, I'll give you 20% off if you just give me your email address and your address or something." I'm like, 20% off? Yeah, I'll do that. And then I give it to this random store I'm never gonna go to again. I don't know where it's gone. I'm gonna get spam emails for the next several years. And I just think we're too easy to give our data up without knowing the value of it. Like, it's actually
Mm.
really valuable, and companies are like killing themselves to get more of our data so that they can advertise to us better. So I think it's about kind of protecting that and making sure that you feel, yeah, that you just see the value of it, I think, and I think that's changing, but
Yeah,
slowly.
it's interesting. I think for anyone, when you're going out there and someone's giving you something for free, it's not for free.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's the way to think about it. The 20%, the free this, free that, they want your data,
Totally.
and that's what you're paying with. And for some people, they're like, "Okay, let them get my email. I'll just block the spam." But it goes to, I guess, how much of your data can be connected to your email address,
Yeah.
when you give them the email address, and how will that be used maybe to manipulate you, and what kind of future are we going into where the government holds that data, and what kind of government is that
Yeah.
becomes really important. So it's it, it's great in that we're able to kind of give our data and get also so much back in terms of connections and things like that. But there is a cost, and that is the cost, and we
Yeah.
just need to be mindful of that.
Yeah. And I think part of it is the decision that you have to make. And I actually don't know if you can make the decision. I think it might just happen to us. I guess you make it by voting, but if do you want large companies like Meta to have your data, or do you want that to be regulated by the government and ideally protected by the government? And I err on the side of I want the government to protect my data, but then it becomes really dangerous, doesn't it?
Mm.
It's who you're giving up your most valuable online information to. Um, and yeah, it's either, you can get completely targeted ads from just mentioning something in passing conversation to your friends, or, the government has loads of information, which you could argue they probably already do have that information anyway. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's just a weird time.
Just on the targeted ads, I used to do this thing where if I wanna buy something, I will first Google it, and look for products, and then wait a few days, and then go on Amazon and find that product discounted. And I'm like, "These guys are just tracking everything."
They are.
Uh,
Even
yeah.
I know that we're all like, "Oh, yeah, our phones don't listen to us." I know that at first the argument was, well, if you're talking about your shoes, you probably Googled it and then the cookies and blah, blah, blah. But honestly, some of the things that have been coming up just out of like a friend mentioning something next to me, I'm like, "Oh,
Mhm.
man, that is really hectic. I don't want to be advertised for this." But yeah,
Do you actually think they're listening? Or is it I've heard they might be listening, but also when 2 phones come together, some data is kind of connected between the 2 phones, and if that person has Googled cameras,
yeah,
it's likely that when he meets you, you're gonna talk about some cameras or something like that, and
yeah.
so cameras shown.
No, I think that's what it is, but it's becoming really sophisticated. Like, I complimented my friend's shoes the other day, and then she told me where they were from. But as I was I didn't look them up, but she would have looked them up. And so then it could have been coincidence that I was targeted these shoes, but they're kind of niche. And yeah, I don't think that they're listening. Like, I think that would be such a breach of privacy that someone would have done something about that. I'd like to think, but
Yeah,
yeah, I
yeah.
think it is
Let's
actually.
leave the listening to the spy agencies and,
Yeah,
worry about that.
when
Yeah,
you say something and you have to be like, I didn't say that, just to be clear.
yeah. Rachel, it was great speaking to you. Where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, and I've got a cool Policy Blocks website that I write about all this stuff in detail, and it will be explained better than I can explain it verbally. So check it out, policyblocks.co. And yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so
That was
much.
very interesting. So really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.